So, tonight's presentation is titled Valuing Water, and our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Alex Money, Principal Investigator and Founder in Residence at the University of Oxford's Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. Alex is the founder and CEO of Watermark, an early stage company with a mission to break the status quo on how water is valued. Concurrently, Alex is a principal investigator and founder in residence at the Oxford University Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. His part-time external appointments include Chief Investment Advisor to the Africa Water Investment Programme, member of the Global Water Partnerships Technical Committee, and court member of the Worshipful Company of Water Conservators. I should just correct that. Sorry, he's now Walbert Warden of the Water Conservators Company. Sorry about that, Alex. So over to you, Alex.
Rob, thanks so much for that introduction. I'm sharing a screen. Let me just make sure the right screen is being shared. Is it the presentation? The full
That's
presentation?
right. Valuing water. Well done.
Okay. Okay, very good. Well, it's a pleasure to be doing this webinar today. I made the mistake of actually looking at the participants a second ago and realized that there are a lot of participants on this call that have vastly more experience in water than I. So I feel slightly nervous, I suppose, in being the person in the box seat. But I guess what I'd say about this session is that I guess it's a slightly personal perspective on this issue, informed by about 20 years, I think, of working in and around water and investment and finance and so forth. And it's obviously only a subset of all the many things that we could be talking about in this subject. But I hope that it shows a little bit of the sort of thinking that goes on amongst members of the company. There's a lot of different perspectives, and I hope evidence of original thinking and so forth. And this is one of the reasons why we're so happy to host these webinars, but also I'm personally very proud and pleased to be a member of the company. Okay, so the topic is valuing water, and the way I'm going to do this is in that typical way of probably starting off with some of the bad stuff and hopefully segueing on to some of the reasons for optimism and the opportunities for some fresh thinking, which is, I think, at the end of the day, what this sector would always benefit from more. So with that, let me just take you through to the so everything seems to have crashed, which is slightly frustrating. Am I still there?
You've come up with a different screen now. It's just got the Zoom
I?
screen on there, Alex.
Right. I'm sorry. Give me 2 seconds to just get this thing restarted. The best laid plans of mice and men. Right. So if I try this again. Is it up again?
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. Sorry about that.
No problems.
So I call it a class. It's obviously not a class, it's a webinar, but this is just a habit I have from the lectures that I give here. So but I think the same principle applies, which is what am I trying to get across here? There's 4 things really. I want to talk a bit about what I describe as water's image problem. I want to describe the status quo, particularly with reference to the Sustainable Development Goal number 6, and give some context for that. Um, the third thing I'd like to do is frame how current approaches or current responses to meeting the SDGs look, and then finally propose a reframing, I guess, of the approaches that are currently being taken, which I think would more likely result in an improvement of the status quo and probably a more sustainable sector in many places. Should qualify my comments here as I'm a development guy, so most of my work is in the developing world, and so I look at water and talk about water very much from that perspective. I think, arguably one could look at this quite differently if you were taking a UK-centric perspective, for example. So just advance apologies to those who were looking for something more domestic. This is thinking about the issue more from a development and international perspective. But with that, let's just get on. So when I say water has an image problem, I just want to set up what I mean by that. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this image, which was taken about 35 years ago now by NASA's Voyager. This image was used in the front of Carl Sagan's book, Pale Blue Dot, and it is, of course, Earth from space. And the point I want to focus on there is the pale blue, which is essentially highlighting the extent of water that comprises the planet as seen from space. And a sort of zoomed up and a more conventional view of that are images like this. This one from the National Geographic, which again just emphasizes the amount of surface water or seawater that the planet comprises. Indeed, it covers 70%, as we know, and this is material actually from my son's GCSE materials, which I happened to be looking at the other day, and I think this is the point to what I want to get to, which is this idea. There is a perception that has been baked in, I think, from most people's formative years about abundance of water, certainly in the context of the planet, and it's not just water around us. It's sort of water within us. Again, borrowing from my son's GCSE materials, I was looking at slides and stuff that he has that highlights that the human body itself is between 60 and 70% comprised of water. So there's these two things of this idea of abundance and this idea of ubiquity, or just a lot of it everywhere, that seems to inform a lot of the thinking around water, certainly from a global north perspective, from really quite formative ages. And the challenge with this idea of perceived abundance and perceived ubiquity is how it makes people think about water. Doxastic assumptions. I'm an Oxford academic, so I'm bound to use slightly poncy words, but essentially these are belief systems, or what we consider universal truths. And around water there are basically two of these that seem to permeate. And the first of this is thinking about it as a basic human right, and secondly, that is something that you can't live without. Both of which are both of which are probably true, or certainly true in the case of the second. But in a perverse sense, they slightly contribute to this problem about water in terms of its image. And actually, there's nothing new in how we think about this in terms of water. So this is going back to a pretty famous poem by Samuel Coleridge, which again is just highlighting this idea that although water may be abundant and ubiquitous, it doesn't always mean that it's available for the purpose that you need it. And moving from literature to economics, around the same time, Adam Smith, when he wrote Wealth of Nations, highlighted this idea of the diamond water paradox, which essentially talks to the point that it's perceived abundance and ubiquity means that it's often misvalued. Whereas, I mean, as the paradox of value sort of points out, if you were given the choice of uh, you know having some water or a diamond, you'd probably take the diamond most times. But if you were told that you would not have anything other than a glass of water for the next few days, or you could have a diamond, people would probably choose the water. And this idea of this paradox of value is kind of what underpins uh, uh, part of the discussion that I just wanted to bring up in this webinar today. This problem, water's image problem matters, I would say, for lots of different reasons. But just to maybe highlight some of the things that I focus on in my own work here. I mean, the first is just the extent to which water stress is a global economic challenge. You know, around a third of global GDP is forecast to be exposed to high water stress by 2050. Today, right now, 4 billion people of the planet experience water scarcity for at least 1 month each year. Approaching 2/5 of the world's population don't have access to safe sanitation today. And then from the more finance oriented perspective, the amount of investment that's needed in water infrastructure to make it climate resilient for the future, approaches something like 40 billion a year just in the developing world. And if that wasn't enough, we know what demographics do to these statistics. Populations are growing, particularly in areas where water is either physically or economically scarce. Climate change is exacerbating these challenges by driving longer, drier periods and shorter, more intense wet periods where the resource can't easily be managed and captured. But with all of that going on, there still seem to be some fundamental challenges in terms of what do we do about this. So people have worked on this, and I just want to sort of highlight what I describe as some of water's image consultants. And just to say at the outset, these people do great work, and it is really important work to be done. But as you'll probably see, I'm not sure it's quite enough to deal with what we have. So, but just to give you some examples. Just on this first example, when we think about the surface of the Earth and the amount of water that's on there, that of course is quite misleading, because if we think about the mass of the Earth, the seawater only goes down so far, and looking at the mass of the Earth and thinking about the water available, as you can see, the largest drop there represents all the water, including seawater, relative to the mass of the Earth. The mid-sized drop, well, mid-sized that this drop just here, that's all the fresh water, which includes water that's locked up in the ice and in the glaciers. And then you can probably barely see it, but I put a little circle around it. This tiny little drop there is the available fresh water, essentially the water in lakes and rivers. And it's used visually sometimes, and this is from the US Geological Survey, to kind of just give a different perspective on this idea of abundance in the context of the planetary boundary. Other framings of the scarcity dynamic include this work that's been ongoing for many years, actually, by the WRI, the World Resources Institute, which uses a series of indicators to score countries in terms of their water stress around the world. This cut is principally of Europe, Asia, and Africa, but again, an attempt to visually communicate the sort of the relative levels of stress and scarcity. Yet other approaches include what are described as sort of risk-based approaches. So the World Economic Forum, when they meet at Davos every year, put out a sort of global risks report, or an inventory of the biggest risks that their members believe they face, and It's hard to read, I know, but the circle at the top is essentially water-related risk. And for the last few years, these risks routinely appear right at the top of lists such as these. But what we've learned from the last few years, or the last 10 years at least, reviewing the sort of information that's been produced and the communication that's been going around it, is that actually, in terms of the action that it precipitates, these physical representations of scarcity don't really seem to precipitate much action. Risk-based framings of these crises, again, themselves don't precipitate much action. And even economically quantifying, the need to move from the current situation doesn't in itself precipitate much action, which really sort of begs the question, well, what does? Since 2015, so this year, 2025, marks the 10th anniversary of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and when these goals were conceived, amongst the many objectives hoped for them was they could act as a sort of action lever to precipitate the sorts of action that were self-evidently necessary to to address the current situation with water availability. Most of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the fact that SDG 6 actually comprises a whole bunch of sub goals and then many indicators within these goals. So actually communicating around SDG 6 is challenging. People find it difficult, and in a sense, it's one of the things that have made this as an action lever slightly difficult to work around. But people have tried pretty hard. So logic-led framings have sort of emphasized the idea that actually for all of the 17 goals, water is kind of central to all of them. None of these goals can intrinsically be easily achieved, if at all, without addressing water. And then to get into more detail, specific goals have been highlighted in various programs by development banks, NGOs, corporates, all sorts of government entities, also all sorts of people, to kind of make this relationship between addressing SDG 6 and then the direct benefits or the direct levers that it creates to addressing some of these other global goals. But obviously SDG 6 or the SDGs in general have had a much wider audience than that. And I'm just going to go through a couple of other examples of the sorts of framings that have been used to think about action levers around SDG 6. And the policy-led ones, so these are governments and national institutions and multilaterals and so forth, have broadly focused on what's called integrated water resource management, or IWRM, within which there are sort of four things that the emphasis is on: the sort of enabling environment, institutional, institutions and regulation, and all that goes with that, thinking about the financing components, and also just the tools and instruments that are available for management. And again, all of these components are sort of brought together in this idea of an integrated management framework as a way to leverage action away from policy frameworks, corporates. So the SDG 6 narrative, or the sustainable development narrative, has been sort of widely adopted in the private sector, and here again, the framings are aligned to think about SDG 6 as an action lever, but through the lens of how water is used by companies, what risks that precipitates at the sort of watershed or catchment level, how actions can be prioritized to mitigate those risks, how policies, so these are more corporate policies, can be developed and improved as a basis of corporate governance around water stewardship, and then how these things can be communicated. Beyond corporates and governments, there's another framing that's been uh, widely kind of used in the last few years, which is really around this idea of collective action, which is basically to say that it's not something that just governments or corporates or NGOs or anyone else can do by themselves, but actually the action lever for SDG 6 requires a collective approach. And I'll spare you by reading off the different circles, but that is the general idea that actually holistically that is the way to go forward with. And I think all of these framings, make a lot of sense intrinsically, but the issue is really just looking at the outcomes. So what I'm showing you on this slide is from UN Water. So it's the official scorecard, if you like, or the official dashboard that's used to track global progress against the various indicators around SDG 6. And essentially, for most of these indicators, barring a couple, 100% is good and 0% is bad, with the exception of water stress, I think, in ecosystems. And really, all I'm trying to show here is that there's a good understanding, generally speaking, of the need to do better and need to do more, etc. There's been quite a lot of time being spent and a lot of money being spent in various ways to try to precipitate those actions. But in reality, against nearly all of these indicators, progress is mixed to not great, I suppose, what one might say. But I guess more importantly than that, certainly from a development perspective, is that these numbers aren't really moving very much, and so you could have generated this same dashboard, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and you wouldn't see a material improvement in most of these indicators. So that's kind of I guess, kind of the bad stuff. So what we've really learned around, particularly around SDG 6 and progress and attempts to make progress in the last decade or so, is that fundamentally water's image problem remains broadly intact. It hasn't been fundamentally reversed or addressed, and that progress, such as we've seen it, has in many cases been quite small and incremental. For many indicators, it's plateaued, and sadly, in certain cases, actually progress is going backwards. The current framings that are being used, and we sort of cycle through a bunch of them, have probably moved the dial a bit, but really only quite marginally. And as we sit today in early 2025, looking at progress, it's not immediately obvious, I don't think, what will change the status quo. And essentially that's where a lot of my work here at Oxford and in the company that I run, Watermark, is thinking about. Is like how does the status quo actually change? And I think thinking about the elephant in the room, which is water value and how we value water, I think is probably the way that this discussion needs to move forward. So maybe to help describe what I mean by that elephant in the room. So we can think about the system, I suppose, in terms of three sort of discrete components. There's the sort of idea of managing the resource, delivering water supply and services, and then if that's being done, to then ensure essentially resilient, continuous access to safe water, which is a paraphrase of SDG 6. So where are we? Well, I would say that we're struggling very hard at the moment to move from effectively managing the water resource to delivering improved water supply and services, and as a consequence of that, struggling to meet these SDG objectives. And there are two kind of critical points of failure that I would suggest need to be focused on. The first is around the valuing of water resources. And, I would argue that water resources are fundamentally misvalued because the approaches that are currently being used effectively neglect to emphasize who is using it, when, where, and how much of the resource is being used, and crucially, what is being used for relative to the amount of water available and the quality of the water available. And without having a good value signal, water is just routinely used inefficiently and often wastefully. And that has actually takes place whether water is relatively abundant or particularly scarce. It doesn't seem to fundamentally change this idea that the resource is not used efficiently. And that, I would argue, comes down to the fact that there isn't an effective value signal or a value framework which goes beyond the volume of water, but actually thinks about who it's for and what it's for. So that's kind of point of failure number one. Point of failure number two is really around how you move from the provision of supply and services to the sort of this idea of resilient continuous access. And that fundamentally requires investment. And one of the reasons why the performance against SDG 6 hasn't changed very much is down to just this chronic underinvestment in water security. And this underinvestment is completely rational and understandable. Without the value signal that we sort of described first off, there just aren't the incentives to ensure that sustainable investment is being made to to deliver against SDG 6. And the reality is there isn't enough public sector money in the world to finance that investment. So the only way the infrastructure that's needed to manage water resources, deliver improved supply and services, the only way the current gap can be closed is through leveraging capital from the private sector to go with whatever the public spending is. And capital from the private sector needs needs a return. It's there to pay out pensions for people in the long run and so forth. So it's never going to be free money. And so for that sort of investment to become available, there needs to be the potential for return, and there needs to be the incentives then to make that capital available. And I think in the absence of those incentives, the investment doesn't flow. And the incentive itself needs a strong value signal around water. And that's essentially, I think, in summary, what the current problem is. And no level of image consultancy around water, or describing why, describing maps that show it's scarce in a place, or coming up with lots of elaborate box diagrams, a bit like these. Lots of box diagrams saying, well, what you need is a better governance or a better enabling environment. Or, all of those things are probably, they have their place and are particularly salient, I think, in countries which have well-regulated water sectors and where the investment signals are clear. But those are few and far between, and I don't think we need to look very far from home to recognize that actually the signals for investment into water infrastructure just aren't fit for purpose in the way that they stand. So this is kind of the focus of what we're interested in, and this is how we think about this. So just taking the same taking the same framework and looking at it another way. If we could identify at a high level of resolution who is using how much water, when, where, and for what purpose, we could potentially develop a valuation framework that recognizes that water has different levels of utility or value to different people, and depending on what it's being used for. Maybe the way I try to describe this is to think about is through an analogy. So you might imagine getting on a plane from I don't know, London to, I don't know, New York or somewhere, And so the reason you're getting on that plane is essentially to travel from one place to the other. But when you look at the passengers on that plane, um, they will have all paid, they will have paid quite different prices for their tickets. So there'll be people that, you know, want to want to arrive in New York, I don't know, ready for their meetings and whatnot. And so having a good night's sleep on the flight, and etc., is really important to them. And so they will pay a price for that service to travel, turn left on the plane and all of that. There'll be others who are just regular travelers and are looking for a relatively efficient but economical way to get to where they want to go to. And there'll be those like my kids who want the cheapest possible flight they can get so that they can go off and explore and all of those things, and they will pay the least. The point I'm trying to make with that analogy is fundamentally everyone's getting on the plane to go from London to New York. That is the service, if you like. But how they value that service based on what what their needs are, as different consumers, is actually very different. And this applies in exactly the same way in the water sector. We can broadly distinguish between agricultural, industrial, and domestic users of water, all of whom have very different profiles in terms of how much water they use, the purpose they use the water for, and the utility or value that they derive from it. Individuals will use, in relative terms, small amounts of water for hygiene, hydration, sanitation, and basic needs. And that water is obviously extremely valuable, but quite a small amount is being used. And then after those needs are met, the sort of marginal utility or the sort of additional value they get from every unit of water very quickly falls towards zero. Whereas you might think about an industrial user who's sort of abstracting water in a production process, for whom the water has direct value to each unit of stuff that they're making. For that user, the sort of marginal utility of water stays really high, right? Each incremental unit of water stays about the same because they wouldn't be using it unless they were making a product or selling it, at a return. And so I think it's important to think about the distinction between the value of water that's being ascribed to these different types of users, and then incorporating that in a reflective way to tariffs, pricing, and structures, such that those that extract the greatest value from using a resource pay relatively more for the value they abstract. And that is essentially used to ensure that those who need the resource, for basic needs, can have it in an affordable way. And by building in some level of differentiation, value-based, value-reflective tariffs, and that differentiate between those, that is a model to then trigger the kind of incentives that would mobilize investment into the sector. And that is really what that is the kind of missing piece, I think, to get from where we are to where we'd like to be, which is around having resilient, continuous access to water. You might be thinking, well, that sounds fine in a sort of PowerPoint theory, but how do we do it? And actually, there are now really a great deal more ways to be able to try to understand both that value framing, but then to actually describe and implement methods to differentiate between users, and to introduce ideas like shadow water prices that can be developed to optimize for these different outcomes. And that's a lot of the work that I do. Ultimately, governments, in the most part, regulate access to water, regulate the price of water, and all the other services that relate to it. They almost exclusively manage the resource fundamentally, even if the delivery of supply and services is a mixture between public and private services. And so our work is really focused on engaging with governments, which we do around the world, to kind of make the case for introducing a value reflective approach to how they regulate price, allocate the resource, and make the case essentially that taking that framework is probably the pathway to SDG 6 sustainability, and at the least it should offer some incremental improvement on the current status quo. So that's kind of the thrust of the approach. I think I just wanted to, the last couple of things I'd just like to say about it is that technology is actually creating a huge number of more opportunities for us to do this. So some of the work that we are involved in quite directly is in terms of looking at how very high resolution use of geospatial data and remote sensing, augmented by AI and machine learning, can give very good detail in terms of where water is being used, how much is being used, who is using it, distinguishing between these different types of users. We can do this now not just for surface water, but in many parts of the world where groundwater is the fundamental resource. We can understand the dynamics of that, in ways that we couldn't 5 years ago, 6 years ago, at scale, because we just didn't have the technology and the tools to be able to do this sort of analysis. And so I think there is a sort of transformative unlock going on in how frameworks around valuing water and other things are coming into their own because of our capabilities and what the technology allows us to do today. And this is the sector is often, I think, slightly unfairly accused of lagging innovation. There's actually huge amounts of innovation in water around, the Internet of Things and all of that. But I think in the more orthodox understanding of how do you value a resource, how do you allocate a resource, price it, create the incentives to mobilize the investment in it, we're probably missing a trick still in terms of what these innovations and technologies can let us do. So this is just some examples here from our own work. This is a specific basin in the Zambezi, I think, in Southern Africa. Just thinking about how these things come together. So a valuation framework is ultimately informed by basin level data on the dynamics of water demand and supply. It's the sort of thing that we, for example, and others can produce at scale. Valuing water based on that requires using some sort of context sensitivity. So you need to understand, obviously, how scarce it is or how abundant it is. You need to better understand what the investment requirements might be now and in the future. You need to understand the dynamics of things like demographics, economic growth, climate change, etc. And the thing is, the methodological frameworks to do those things are actually already very well developed. I think there is a gap to be bridged between moving from value to pricing, or a pricing signal. That's kind of the really important part in making these things tractable or effective. And again, the last few years have just seen a step change in how we can incorporate a whole bunch of different parametric data into a pricing framework. The insurance sector sort of led the way with cat risk modeling and so forth, but the property sector and others have sort of given frameworks to say, well, there's lots of different things that influence price, willingness to pay, ability to pay, the different dimensions around value, to be able to synthesize those into a price discovery framework. And that's I'm talking in generic terms here, to spare you the painful detail, but there are really effective ways to optimize pricing against predefined objectives to kind of deliver the outcomes around equity, inclusivity, growth, and so forth, depending on what's being prioritized. And then, of course, with all of these things, they're only as good as their implementation. And so thinking thinking through the sort of decision-ready tools that this information data can be applied to, making sure that outputs are policy-facing and influence and shape and support statutory instruments and regulation, I think is a key thing. But then over and beyond the sort of regulated environment, it's giving capacity to other stakeholders, including industry and finance, that supports reallocation or better allocation of corporate capital or investment capital to have the tools that then, through blended finance and all these other kind of exciting if somewhat underused instruments, can actually be then applied to to actually drive better quality allocation decisions. So yeah, I think I was due to talk for about 40 minutes, so I'm almost there. So maybe I can just summarize by saying that I think, and these are personal perspectives, of course, and I think that when we look at where we are with water, certainly at a global scale, this image problem, which is sort of quite deeply permeated in us, I think, is a real challenge, and it's a real tractable thing to be addressed. The approaches that have been taken to date, I think, have probably improved things at the margin. But when you look at the data, particularly the indicator level data on things like SDG6, and just see how essentially static things have been for quite a long time, one can be left by thinking that probably the status quo isn't going to get us to where we need to get to in any time reasonably soon. Certainly not by 2030, and probably not by 2050. And I think there is an argument, therefore, to apply a value-based approach, not at the exclusion of everything else, but to recognize that even this idea of cost-reflective tariffs are probably not in themselves the most effective way to mobilize the sort of investment and incentives, again, taking a global development context, relative to taking a more value-based approach that reflects the fact that water is valuable and has different value to different types of users. And then to actually make all these things move from, theory into practice, I think we are certainly seeing how technology is fundamentally redefining what is possible, and that, in terms of speed, in terms of cost, in terms of the ability to take information and communicate it effectively, to governments, to regulators, to policymakers, to corporates, to development finance people, and so forth. This feels to me the opportunity, and this is the kind of the basis of optimism, I guess, with which I'd like to kind of end this, end these remarks. So let me end there, and thank you all for listening to that. I'm very happy to take any questions if there are any.